Good morning. I'm Elliott Robinson. I'm the pastor of Nimno AME Church. I wanted to provide a pastoral statement with my thoughts on the guilty verdict of Derek Chauvin, the killer of George Floyd. Now that the trial is over, it is not the end. Sadly, it's really just the beginning of the process. Now that the verdict has come in, we're awaiting sentencing, awaiting appeals that we are hopeful will fail, and then he will serve his time in prison. However, this trial has provided us with a sad reality about really where we are as a country. The expectation that justice simply will not come for people of color. There was so much angst and deep resignation for others that an acquittal was even a possibility. Shows that the American justice system has consistently and persistently failed to provide justice for Black people in this country, especially when victimized by members of law enforcement. The fact that a large portion of the country was relieved that Chauvin was convicted speaks to the epidemic of justified law enforcement violence and deadly interactions with Black people and people of color. I use that language because the fact that we could all sit and watch a law enforcement officer place his knee on the neck of a man who was prone and subdued for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, and there be any doubt in our minds that that person will be found guilty, speaks to the moral and judicial failure of this country. I did not celebrate the verdict. I have decided that I shouldn't have to celebrate the commission of justice in a land that says that people are created equal. I also didn't celebrate because justice was served when I am made in the image of God. Justice is a divine imperative. It is mandated by God, and those who are stewards over this important facet of community should be held to a higher standard and not a lower standard. God requires both mishpat, which is justice, and tzedakah, which is righteousness, in order to be in right relationship with God. God requires that we treat one another and deal with one another within a system of both justice and righteousness. Those terms are used in conjunction with one another many times in the biblical text because they are like sweet tea and like tea and sugar. They just simply go together. Peanut butter and jelly. Justice and righteousness. They are non-negotiable. They were often at the heart of the work of the prophets. And so whether it was Moses, whether it was Isaiah, whether it was Jeremiah, Amos, or Hosea, they were most certainly at the heart of the ministry of Jesus Christ. Justice and righteousness go together. So where do we go from here? We will continue to follow the lead of Micah when Micah says that God is requiring of us to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. We have to continue to demand that we are treated equally, but we should also begin to expect that we will be treated equally because we are made in God's image, and God is not pleased. God is not pleased when we don't treat each other with love, when we don't treat each other with respect, we don't treat each other with kindness. Those were primary lessons that Christ gave us, and we are falling short. We've been divided. We've been divided racially continuously since the founding of this country, divided socially, divided economically. But at the heart of a country that says Christianity is important, we are not together in unity when we don't love one another. And so don't be confused or dismayed that if you harbor anger and hatred in your heart for someone else, if you feel that oppressing someone is appropriate, that is not in the will of God. Nowhere in the biblical text does Jesus Christ say, you know what, it's good for you to sit over and reign over someone else. It's good for you to hold yourself in a higher standard or a higher place than someone else. In fact, he says the one who is the greatest in the kingdom is the least of these. So we need to stop with the rhetoric. We need to stop being used and manipulated by those in politics who are using hatred to raise inordinate and insurmountable amounts of money to fuel their coffers and to fuel their agendas. And we need to go back to what it means to love one another. And until we can do that, we will continue to see hatred. We will continue to see violence. We will continue to see it run rampant and be used as a tool to keep others down. Can it change? Sure. But it can only change when the people who are in the community change. And if you're at a place of worship that's not telling you to love your neighbor, and if you're at a place of worship that justifies hatred, that justifies violence, that justifies law enforcement killings, then guess what? That's not a place that is teaching the teachings of Jesus Christ. If you're listening to things that have you, when you're finished listening to them, hating someone else and wanting the worst for someone and wanting to see something bad happen to a people, a group, or a person, you are being manipulated to not be in God's will. I said that because it's true. Jesus Christ never wanted anyone to hate anyone else, which is why before he left, he said there are two things that which this entire project of humanity sits on. The thing that holds up both the law and the prophets are these two things. Love God with your whole heart, your soul, and your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. And so if that's not at the crux of who you are and what you're believing and what's driving you each day, then you're simply not in God's will for your life. And so how do we change this? People begin to look closely at who we are and what we believe, and then look closely at what God is asking us to do to make the world that we live in better. Because until we do those things, the enemy will continue to sift us like wheat, separate us, divide us, and kill at will. We have to change. We have to individually change so that we can impact the communities that we live in, so that God can get the glory and that we can be all that God calls us to be. But until we do that, there'll be more George Floyds. There'll be more Breonna Taylors. There'll be more killing and violence and justification for killing and violence. We can do better than that, and we can be better than that. But it begins by turning our hearts to Christ and to doing what God is calling each of us to do to make this world better. Thank you so much. Take care, and God bless.